The call from the past. The dead phone rang at 11:47 p.m. when lightning split the sky in half. I stood in Grandma Martha's basement with a box of old books in my hands, spending my fourth straight hour putting off the decision about what to keep and what to throw away. Outside, the kind of storm raged that I hadn't seen since childhood. Wind howled through the chimney. Rain hammered the roof like machine gun fire. And lightning turned the twilight into a strobe light. 4 months had passed since Grandma's funeral, and every time I entered this house, I found a new excuse to postpone the sale for another week. The realtor called every 3 days, reminding me that the market was good, buyers were available, and the house needed investments I didn't have. But I couldn't bring myself to part with the place where I'd spent my childhood. Grandma Martha saved me when I was 4 years old. My parents, Anna and Rick, died in a car crash, and I was left completely orphaned. Grandma took me in, surrounded me with such love and care that I grew up a happy child despite the tragedy. I always said I was lucky. Few people get such a devoted guardian after losing their closest family members. The basement smelled of old paper and dust. Storage boxes with Christmas decorations that Grandma and I brought out every December were kept here, along with stacks of 30 years' worth of Good Housekeeping magazines. My clay school projects that Grandma never had the heart to throw away. In the corner stood an old refrigerator that broke 10 years ago, but Grandma used it as storage for jam jars. And of course, that phone. A dark green rotary device with a worn cord that sat on the table by the furnace. Grandma bought it in the 70s and used it until she switched to modern service. But she never threw it away. She said it reminded her of times when phone calls were events, not background noise of life. I was just going through a box of childhood photos when an especially powerful thunderclap struck. The house shuddered to its foundation, and a second later, the phone started ringing. Not my cell phone, which was upstairs in my purse. This old monster that hadn't worked for 15 years. The sound was so insistent and demanding, as if someone was desperately trying to reach me. I froze with a photograph in my hands. It showed me, at age 7, sitting on Grandma's lap under the Christmas tree. We were both smiling at the camera, happy and content with life. The phone kept ringing, a mechanical, metallic sound that sent shivers down my spine. Finally, I walked over it and picked up the heavy black receiver. I expected to hear dial tones or static, anything except what I actually heard. First came crackling, like an old magnetic tape being played in a worn-out player. Then a child's voice, quiet, frightened, desperately pleading. "Grandma, it's me." Mama and Rick are drinking in the kitchen again and yelling at each other. I'm scared. I hid in my room, but they're being really loud. "Please come." Blood froze in my veins. That voice, it was painfully familiar, but I couldn't figure out from where. Like I'd heard it in distant dreams I couldn't remember when awake. The recording continued. "Grandma, Rick left and slammed the door so hard the windows shook, and Mama is lying on the couch and won't answer when I talk to her. She's breathing, but her eyes are closed. I don't know what to do. There's only milk in the fridge, and the bread ran out yesterday." Lightning struck very close, so close I could feel my hair stand up from static electricity. The lights in the basement went out, and the phone fell silent. I stood in complete darkness, gripping the heavy receiver in my hand, shaking, not from cold, but from some primitive, inexplicable fear. My heart was pounding like crazy, and one obsessive thought spun in my head. That voice, that child's desperate voice. I knew it. I knew it very well. When the electricity returned, I saw an old Panasonic answering machine under the phone table. One of those bulky devices from the 80s with big buttons and a cassette inside. Its wires were half melted, probably from numerous power surges over the years. But a red light was blinking like a beacon in the night. Obviously, that powerful lightning strike created such a surge in the electrical system that long-broken electronics suddenly came to life. I'd read about such cases. Old electronics sometimes temporarily starts working from strong electrical discharges. The display showed 2 messages. I couldn't make myself press the play button for several minutes. My hands were shaking, and there was a lump in my throat. Something about these recordings scared me on a subconscious level. Finally, I decided, pressed play. Again, that same child's voice, this time even more frightened and quiet. "Grandma, Mama is crying and saying strange things to the mirror in the bathroom." "What is she doing there?" "And Rick is yelling at someone on the phone and using bad words. Why can't they be quiet like other grown-ups?" "I want to come to your house. It's peaceful there and smells like pies." The recording cut off there. No more messages. I turned off the answering machine and went upstairs on unsteady legs. Sat in Grandma's favorite chair, the very one where she knitted me sweaters and read me bedtime stories, and tried to make sense of what I'd heard. Who was this frightened child? And why did his voice seem so familiar to me? Moreover, why were the names familiar? Mama and Rick. That's exactly what my parents were called, Anna and Rick. But Grandma always told me about them as wonderful people who loved me very much and dreamed of giving me everything best in life. According to Grandma, Papa Rick worked construction, was a reliable and responsible man who adored his little daughter, and Mama Anna dreamed of becoming a kindergarten teacher because she loved children more than anything in the world. They died in a car crash on their way home from work when I was visiting Grandma for the weekend. A beautiful, sad story about loving parents whom fate took too early. But that child in the recordings, he talked about drinking, screaming adults, about a mama who lay on the couch and wouldn't answer, about an empty fridge and fear. The strangest thing, he called my father just Rick, not Papa or Daddy. Why? Children don't do that. Children are taught to call parents Mama and Papa from earliest age. All night I tossed and turned in bed, replaying those recordings in my head. The child's voice haunted me even in sleep. By morning I understood. I needed to get to the bottom of this. Something in my family history didn't add up, and I had to find out what exactly. First, I drove to Mrs. Carroll, our former neighbor who had lived across the street from Grandma's house for 40 years. If anyone remembered details of my childhood, it was her. This woman had a memory like a computer database. She remembered what every neighbor wore in 1995 and could tell the history of any house in the area. Mrs. Carroll greeted me with her usual warmth, seated me in the kitchen, gave me tea with cookies, and as always, started asking about my children. Only after half an hour of small talk did I carefully steer the conversation toward my parents. The elderly woman was silent for a moment, as if remembering something, then nodded. Of course she remembered Anna and Rick. My mother was a beautiful young woman with long dark hair, and my father was a tall, thin guy. They sometimes came to visit me, but honestly, not for long. They'd greet politely, take me for a walk or to play, and in an hour or two, bring me back to Grandma. I asked if the neighbor had talked much with my parents. Mrs. Carroll admitted she almost never did. They were somehow reserved, withdrawn. To all attempts at conversation, they responded in monosyllables. Martha explained this by saying the young people were very busy, working 2 jobs to save for their own house. Even then, I sensed something was off. If my parents loved me so much, why did they spend so little time with me? And why did they avoid talking with neighbors? Then I asked about the day my parents died. Mrs. Carroll fought hard and said she remembered it vaguely. So many years had passed after all. She only knew that I suddenly started living with Grandma permanently. Before that, I'd come to Martha's for weekends, then go home to my parents. But then Martha told the neighbors, but a tragedy had happened, and I would always be with her now. How did I react to my parents' death? Mrs. Carroll remembered that I was very quiet and scared in the first months. Grandma took me to doctors, saying the child had stress from loss. But gradually, I became happier. Started playing with neighborhood children again and laughing. Martha apparently found the right words to help me cope with grief. After thanking the neighbor for her story, I drove home even more puzzled. It turned out that even people who saw our family didn't really know us. My parents kept their distance. I spent more time with Grandma than with them. And after their death, I was frightened. Frightened by what? Death? Or something else? The next day, I went to the city social services archive. If something really was wrong with my family, there should be documents there. In America, everything gets recorded, especially when it involves children. The social services building looked depressing. A gray concrete cube with small windows, then metal doors. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant and hopelessness. Behind the information desk sat a middle-aged woman with tired eyes. Apparently, working with human problems wears down even the strongest people. I explained that I needed to find information about my family from 40 years ago. The woman spent a long time digging through the computer database, occasionally frowning and rereading something. Finally, she found the right case and looked at me with sympathy. She asked if I was sure I wanted to know the details. Sometimes the past is better left alone, especially when it comes to childhood trauma. I insisted. Then the woman brought a thick folder with faded documents. The case of removing minor Thema Collins from an unfit family. Date, August 1987. The file contained neighbor complaints about constant noise, screaming, sounds of breaking dishes coming from the apartment. Several times, passers-by saw a little girl alone on the street, late in the evening, when she should have been sleeping. The parents abused alcohol and didn't provide proper care for the child. After investigation, social workers removed me from the family and placed me under temporary guardianship of my maternal grandmother. And a month later, my parents died in a car accident. Both were drunk. The world turned upside down. So I was taken from the family not after my parents' death, but before it. And I was taken not because of tragedy, but because my parents were unfit. All these years, I'd been grateful to fate that my parents managed to place me in Grandma's reliable hands before their death. But it turned out the state forcibly removed me from them because they couldn't take care of me. The woman saw how I paled reading the documents. She offered to refer me to a psychologist who specializes in working with adults who experienced childhood trauma. She gave me a referral to the hospital archive. My medical records from that period should be preserved there. The hospital was even more complicated. The archive was in the basement. The archivist nurse was busy with other visitors. And naturally, there was no electronic database from 40 years ago. I had to wait 2 hours until the right person was free, and another hour while she found my childhood medical chart in a sea of yellowed folders. But the result was worth the wait. The chart contained detailed notes from the psychologist who worked with me after removal from the family. Patient admitted in severe stress condition, food refusal, nightmares, bedwetting, avoiding conversations about family and past, shows strong anxiety when mother is mentioned, starts crying, categorically refuses to talk about father, becomes withdrawn when questions persist. Extended psychological rehabilitation recommended in calm, stable environment. Guardian demonstrates exceptional care and understanding of child's needs. And several months later, patient's condition significantly improved. Child became more open, started eating and sleeping normally. Interesting that the girl now talks about good mama and papa who loved her and are now in heaven. Obviously, the guardian created a positive version of family history, which contributes to psychological recovery. Such therapeutic lying is often used when working with traumatized children. I closed the medical chart and left the hospital on shaky legs. The doctor understood what I was just beginning to realize. Grandma didn't just take me after tragedy. She saved me from traumatic childhood and created a new, healing version of my past. But I needed details. What exactly happened in that family? How bad was everything? And most importantly, who could tell me the truth about my real parents? It took 3 days of intensive searching through old phone books, social media, and city archives to find Susan Miller, my mother's only school friend who still lived in our city. She worked as a nurse at a private clinic and agreed to meet with me only after I explained over the phone who I was and why I needed information. We met at a small cafe downtown. Susan turned out to be a woman my age, with light hair and sad blue eyes. She was quiet for a long time when I told her about my search, nervously turning her coffee cup in her hands, and several times trying to say something, but changing her mind. Finally, she sighed and admitted she'd always feared this conversation. Martha had asked her never to tell me the truth about my parents, said it would only hurt, destroy the worldview that had been created. But now that Martha was gone and I'd reached the truth myself, Susan felt I had the right to know. She told me my mother's story, a story I'd never heard. Anna really was a wonderful girl in childhood and youth. Smart, kind, responsible. Dreamed of entering teachers, college, and working with children. She had a real talent for connecting with kids. All the neighborhood children adored her. But when Anna turned 16, her father suddenly died. My grandfather. Heart attack at 42. Nobody expected it. Anna took the loss very hard. She was Daddy's girl. They were very close. Martha worked 2 jobs to make ends meet after her husband's death and simply didn't have time to help her daughter cope with grief. Anna started skipping school, stopped caring about grades, got involved with a bad crowd, teenagers who considered themselves too cool for studying and family responsibilities. They smoked, drank cheap wine in the park, bragged about their adulthood. At first, friends tried to bring Anna back to the right path, but she wouldn't listen. Said alcohol helped her forget the pain, not think about Dad being gone. that life was unfair anyway, so why try? At 17, Anna met Rick. Rick was 3 years older, a handsome guy with long hair and a leather jacket who seemed so mature and experienced to a 17-year-old girl. He worked construction when there was work, and when there wasn't, just hung out with friends. He had an old car, some money for drinks, and a complete absence of future plans. Anna fell in love with all the passion of first love. It seemed to her that Rick was her salvation from loneliness and pain. They started dating, and soon Anna practically moved in with him to a rented room in a bad part of town. Rick treated the relationship lightly. He wasn't an evil person, just irresponsible and selfish. He loved Anna in his way, but wasn't ready for serious relationships, much less family. When Anna got pregnant, Rick got scared. He told her straight that he wasn't ready to be a father and husband, that he didn't want to tie himself down with such obligations at 20. He suggested getting rid of the child, but Anna refused flat out. She begged him to stay, promised everything would be fine, that they'd manage together. Rick finally agreed not to leave her, but set a condition. He wasn't a father to this child. He was just living with the child's mother. No paternal responsibilities, no daddy and address, just Rick. Susan remembered how Anna cried telling her about that conversation. She dreamed so much of a normal family, of a husband who would be proud of his wife and child. Instead, she got a live-in boyfriend who agreed to tolerate the child but not love him. After my birth, it only got worse. Rick really didn't participate in raising me, didn't get up with the baby at night, didn't change diapers, didn't play with me. Anna was left to herself with a newborn baby, without support or experience. She started drinking even more, now not from grief over her father, but from despair and exhaustion. Alcohol helped her forget that the dreamed-of family hadn't worked out, that the man beside her didn't want to be a father, that life had gone wrong. Rick drank too, simply because it was part of his lifestyle. He wasn't an alcoholic in the clinical sense, but regularly drank with friends, and there was always beer or something stronger at home. Susan told me how Anna sometimes came to her with 2-year-old me in her arms, all in tears. She'd complain that there were constant fights at home. She demanded Rick participate in family life, and he said he owed her nothing, that he earned money, and the rest wasn't his problem. Often there were binges, sometimes one of them, sometimes both at once. On such days, I was left practically without supervision. Neighbors complained about screaming, noise, sounds of breaking dishes. Several times, passers-by found me alone in the yard while my parents slept at home. Anna periodically brought me to Grandma Martha for a few days. She'd say there was renovation at home, or that she needed to go somewhere on business. But everyone understood the real reason. It was turbulent at home, and the child needed stability. Martha tried to help her daughter. She offered to come home together with her granddaughter, leave that irresponsible guy, start a new life. But Anna refused. She still loved Rick and hoped he'd change, become a real father and husband. The situation kept getting worse. Neighbors began regularly calling police because of noise. Social services received several complaints about the family. And finally, what everyone feared happened. I was officially taken from the family and placed under Grandma's guardianship. Susan remembered that day. Anna called her, sobbing into the phone, saying people from child services came and took her daughter away. That now she had to prove her ability to be a mother to get the child back. But instead of quitting drinking and breaking up with Rick, Anna went into an even deeper binge. She couldn't cope with the guilt, the shame, the fact that she'd lost her own child. And a month later, the accident happened. Anna and Rick were driving to friend's party. Both were drunk. Rick got behind the wheel despite his condition. On the slippery road, the car flew into a ditch and crashed into a tree. Both died instantly. Susan finished her story and fell silent. Staring into her long, cold coffee cup, I sat across from her, unable to say a word. My entire beautiful family story had collapsed in half an hour. But what shocked me most was something else. I asked Susan directly, "Did my parents love me?" She answered honestly. Anna adored me, but didn't know how to show it properly. She was still a child herself, scared and confused, who'd fallen into a trap of circumstances. Deep down, she wanted to be a good mother, but didn't know how. And alcohol clouded her judgment and prevented good decisions. Rick didn't hate me, but didn't love me either. He just didn't feel like a father. To him, I was his girlfriend's child, nothing more. He wasn't cruel, didn't hurt me on purpose, just ignored me. And that was possibly even worse. When Martha took me into guardianship, everyone, including Anna, felt relief. Everyone understood it would be better for the child. Susan ended with a phrase that stuck in my memory. When Anna called her for the last time before that fatal trip, she was crying and saying she dreamed of becoming a good mother, taking her daughter home, starting everything over. But it was already too late. I thanked Susan and drove home with a heavy heart. In the car, I fiddled with the radio, trying to distract myself, but thoughts kept returning to the same thing. My entire beautiful family story had collapsed in one conversation. My parents weren't a happy couple who died tragically in the bloom of love. They were two young people who couldn't cope with life, who drank to drown pain and didn't know how to be parents. And I'd spent my whole life thanking them for love that possibly didn't exist. What hurt me most was understanding that my father didn't consider me his daughter. All my life, I'd told my husband and children about Grandpa Rick, who would be so proud of his grandchildren. But he didn't even want me to call him Daddy. By evening, anger was washing over me in waves. How dare Grandma decide for me? How dare she steal my real past and replace it with a made-up fairy tale? Maybe I had the right to know the truth. Maybe I could have coped with it and become stronger precisely through overcoming. All my life, I'd built my personality based on imaginary parents. When things were hard, I fought. They wouldn't have given up in my place. When making important decisions, I asked myself, what would Mama and Papa do? When raising children, I tried to be as loving as they were. And now it turned out I was imitating phantoms. The next day, I came to Grandma's house in a state close to fury. I wanted to demolish these decorations of happy childhood, throw out all the false memories, clear the space of lies. I went up to the living room and began examining family photos on the dresser. My childhood was captured here, year by year. First day of school, birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings. In every shot, I was smiling, happy, surrounded by Grandma's care. But among the childhood photos was one special one, in a beautiful silver frame. Me with my parents. I'm about 3 years old. We're standing against some park background, all smiling at the camera. Anna is beautiful, with long dark hair and a bright dress. Rick is hugging both of us, with a satisfied smile on his face. We look like a model happy family from baby food advertisements. But now I understood the truth about this photo. This was one of the rare good days when both were sober and pretending we had a normal family. Possibly this was a specially arranged photo session for Grandma, to show that the child was fine, that parents were taking care of him. And an hour after this shot, probably the usual screaming, fighting, and drinking began. In a burst of anger, I grabbed the frame and hurled it onto the parquet floor. Glass shattered into sharp pieces, and the photograph slipped out and fell face down. At that same moment, as if the heavens were answering my rage, a new storm began. Lightning struck the house with such force that I felt my hair stand up from static discharge. All the light bulbs in the house flickered and went out. Something crashed upstairs. I went up to the second floor to check the damage. In the attic, where I rarely looked, only when I needed to get Christmas decorations or hide something unnecessary, part of the floorboard had cracked and fallen away from the powerful lightning strike. I turned on my phone's flashlight and looked into the opening that had formed. Behind the broken board was a small niche, and in it lay a stack of old-lined notebooks tied with a faded yellow ribbon. The notebooks were covered with dust. Apparently they'd lain here for years. I got them out and went down to the living room, untied the ribbon with shaking fingers. Grandma's diary. I read all night without stopping. The entries began with that very August, 1987, when I was taken from my parents. Page after page revealed the truth about what Grandma went through, taking in a traumatized child. In the first entries, I could see how she agonized, not knowing what to tell me. How she searched for words to explain to a 4-year-old girl why Mama slept on the floor, why there was no food in the house, why adults constantly screamed. How she couldn't find the strength to tell the truth that my own father didn't want me to call him Daddy. Anger slowly retreated, giving way to amazement. Grandma didn't just make up a beautiful story. She methodically, day by day, created a new reality for a traumatized child. First, she told me that my parents were sick, but doctors were treating them. Then, when it became clear that both had died in the crash, she carefully prepared me for the thought that Mama and Papa had gone far away and couldn't come back. And when I cried and asked why they left me, Grandma understood. She couldn't let a child think she'd been abandoned. Then she created the story about an accident, about parents who loved me very much, but died in a crash, about how they dreamed of raising me happy and would definitely be proud of me. Further came entries about how I gradually accepted this new version of events, how I stopped crying at night and started telling dolls about good Mama and Papa in heaven, how I wrote school essays about hero parents, how my entire personality formed around the belief that I was the daughter of wonderful people. I read entries about my school years, about how Grandma invented more and more details about my parents to support my faith in them, how she showed me old photos of Anna where she looked beautiful and healthy, and told me about her non-existent dreams of becoming a teacher, how she created the image of a responsible father, Rick, who worked tirelessly for his family. By the middle of the diary, I was already crying from gratitude. Grandma recorded my successes, school awards, getting into university, meeting my future husband, and each time noted how memory of my parents helped me become better, how faith in their love gave me strength in difficult moments. In the last entries, made with an already shaking hand, Grandma wrote about my children, about how I named my daughter Anna in honor of Mama, and how I tell the little ones about wonderful Grandma and Grandpa they'll never see, about how these imaginary people continue to do good, now through me and my children. The final entry ended with a request for forgiveness and hope that if I ever learned the truth, I would understand. She gave me not lies, but wings. I closed the diary and sat in silence while the storm gradually quieted outside the windows. Tears flowed down my cheeks, but these weren't tears of grief, tears of deepest gratitude. Grandma didn't deceive me. She gave me healing. All my life I drew strength from the image of loving parents. In college, when studying was hard, I thought about how Mama dreamed I'd get an education. When starting my career, I imagined how Papa would be proud of my achievements. Raising my own children, I tried to be as patient and caring as I imagined my Mama was. In difficult periods of family life, when my husband and I had disagreements, I thought about how strong my parents' love was, and this helped me not give up. When children were cranky or sick, I remembered Grandma's stories about how tenderly Mama and Papa cared for me, and drew from this strength for patience. These imaginary parents really did raise me, not genetically, but morally. They taught me to believe in love, in family, in the fact that I deserved happiness and was capable of giving that happiness to others. And what would knowledge about real parents have given me? Shame for an alcoholic mother? Pain that my father didn't want me? An inferiority complex? Fear that I'd repeat their mistakes? Grandma understood this better than any psychologist. She knew that a 4-year-old child needed not truth, but hope. Not facts, but love. Not real parents, but ideal ones. And the most amazing thing, these ideal parents became part of me. When people said I was kind, I thought, that's from Mama. When they praised my responsibility, I remembered, Papa was just as reliable. When my husband said I was a good wife and mother, I felt I was living up to the expectations of those who gave me life. The imaginary parents turned out better than real ones in every sense. Now I understood why doctors wrote in the medical chart about therapeutic lying. Grandma intuitively did what modern psychologists recommend, created a positive story for a traumatized child. But one question remained. Why did I learn the truth precisely now? Why did the storm turn on the answering machine exactly when I was cleaning out the house? Why did lightning strike the attic precisely when I was angry at Grandma? I reread the last pages of the diary and found the answer. It turned out Grandma had always feared this day. Feared that I'd somehow learn the truth accidentally, from old neighbors, from archived documents, from gossip. So she decided to leave me an explanation, in case the truth surfaced after her death. She hid the answering machine with those recordings on purpose, and the diary too. This was her letter to me from the past, an explanation of her actions, a request for understanding. Grandma knew that sooner or later I'd uncover her secret, and she prepared an explanation for me in advance. The next day, I called my husband at work and told him about my discovery. Tom listened carefully, without interrupting, and when I finished, he said what I was beginning to understand myself. It didn't matter what my biological parents were like. What mattered was that faith in their love made me the woman he fell in love with, the mother I became to our children. What mattered was that this faith taught me to value family, be faithful, care for loved ones. Tom added that he'd always admired how warmly I spoke about parents I barely remembered. Now he understood where that warmth came from Grandma's boundless love, who created the image of an ideal family for me. That evening, I returned to Grandma's house to clean up the broken frame. I carefully collected the glass and examined the photograph in bright light. Now I saw it completely differently. Yes, this was a rare good moment in a troubled life, but it was also part of the truth. On the day this picture was taken, Anna and Rick really tried to be good parents. Anna really loved me, even if she couldn't show it constantly. And Rick, maybe at that moment, he too felt something parental. This shot wasn't a lie, but a dream. A dream of what my parents could have been in the best version of themselves. I put the photograph in a new frame and placed it back on the dresser. Next to it stood pictures of my children, my husband, Grandma, a big family where everyone was loved and needed. I called the realtor and said the house was off the market. A week later, we had a family dinner at Grandma's house. Me, my husband, our 2 children. 10-year-old David explored the attic and basement like a real archaeologist, and 5-year-old Anna played in the living room with dolls, just like I once did. At dinner, I told my family the story I'd learned. Not all of it, of course. Children don't need details about drinking and dysfunction. But I conveyed the main idea. Sometimes people who love us give us beautiful stories instead of painful facts. And this isn't deception, but care. David, who at 10 was already reading adult books and asking complex questions, asked, "So great-grandma lied about great-grandpa and great-grandma?" I answered that great-grandma told me about what my parents could have been in the best version of themselves. And this version helped me grow up happy. And little Anna, who inherited my tendency towards serious thinking, said, "So great-grandma was like a fairy from a story who turns bad stories into good ones." "Exactly," I answered, "just like a good fairy." After dinner, the children played in the garden while my husband and I sat on the porch planning how to set up the house for regular family gatherings. Tom suggested making the basement into a playroom for kids and the attic into my craft room where I could do the needlework I'd grown to love in recent years. And we decided to leave that old phone as it was, as a memory of Grandma and her wisdom. Leaving, I went down to the basement one more time. I walked up to the phone and said quietly, "Thank you, Grandma, for giving me better parents than nature could have." Of course, no one answered. The phone was silent. But a few days later, when we came as a family for the weekend, something amazing happened. Little Anna was playing in the basement with dolls, and I heard her talking to them in a quiet, serious voice. I went down to see what she was doing. It turned out my daughter was playing grandma and granddaughter. One doll was telling another beautiful stories about good parents, and the second was listening and becoming happier. I asked Anna where she learned such a game. The girl answered that the old phone told her, that when she put her ear to the receiver, she heard the voice of a kind grandma singing a lullaby about love that never ends. I knew the phone couldn't have told her anything. It didn't work anymore. But for a 5-year-old child, the boundary between reality and magic is very thin. And perhaps that's for the best. Anna is growing up confident that she comes from good people who loved her, that family love passes through generations, making each next one a little better than the previous. And this is truth, the truth that Grandma Martha created. A year has passed since that evening when the dead phone rang in the storm. The house became our family nest. On weekends, not only we come here, but friends with children too. The house is filled with laughter, conversations, the smell of home baking. And in the basement, on the old table by the furnace, that same phone still stands. Children sometimes play near it, imagining they're talking to great-grandma Martha. And each time they tell her how happy they are, how much they love their family, how proud they are of their roots. The phone never rang again. No power surges, no old recordings, no mysticism. Apparently, Grandma's mission really was accomplished. She taught me the most important truth. Real love sometimes means giving a beautiful dream instead of painful reality. Thanks to this dream, I grew up not a broken victim of tragic circumstances, but a happy person who believes in goodness and can pass this faith on. My ideal parents never existed in the physical world, but their love was absolutely real because it lived in Grandma's heart and through her passed to me. And now I pass this love to my children, and they grow up confident that they come from wonderful people. Recently, 10-year-old David asked me why I always speak so warmly about great-grandpa and great-grandma I never saw. I answered him truthfully, because they live in my heart, and everything that lives in the heart with love becomes real. Isn't this the meaning of family? Love that passes from generation to generation, turning each next one into a better version of the previous. Grandma Martha took two unhappy, lost young people and turned them into a source of strength for her granddaughter. And this strength keeps working. In my children, in how I raise them, in the family we build every day. Sometimes in the evenings, when the children are already asleep and my husband is reading in the living room, I go down to the basement and sit next to that old phone. I don't wait for calls and don't hope for new mystical revelations. I just thank Grandma for the greatest gift, for teaching me to love people who never existed, and through this love, become better. And the silent phone stands as a monument to the gentlest lie in history, a lie that healed a child's heart and gave an entire family faith in goodness.